So I just want to share with you that the post-secondary employment outcomes data set is a partnership between institutions, systems, and state post-secondary agencies who share data with the US Census. And those data are matched so we can look at post-secondary outcomes for completers. We can look at earnings. We can look at what we call geographic flow, so where those folks live 1, 5, and 10 years after they graduate and complete their degrees. And then we can also look at the industry of their employment. And so all of these data are really rich and really valuable. And what we're going to present today for you is the results of our very first set of PSEO Coalition Research Grants that were awarded last year in a competitive process. And so with generous support from the Strata Education Foundation and our partners there, we were able to offer, put out an RFP for folks who wanted to use PSEO data in creative ways, whether that be development of a dashboard or interactive tool, whether that be looking at the data to answer a research question. And so we actually have a mix of those today. And we are going to structure it in our next 2 hours, and we will take a break in between for everyone. But we're going to structure it in terms of our 3 dashboard award winners from Montana University System, Iowa Department of Education, and the University of Utah. And we'll do some question and answer with that. If you have questions, you can feel free to type those directly into the chat. We don't have a separate Q&A and a chat function. We're just using the regular Zoom meeting for this so that it can be really collegial and folks can ask questions as they have them. So feel free to type those in the chat. In some cases, we have multiple presenters on a topic. And so those folks can, when they're not presenting, might be able to answer questions directly into the chat. We also can pause and raise those questions up. Annika Meni, who's behind the scenes, and I will be watching the chat for those questions. After we take our intermission, we're going to come back and learn from the folks who won the awards for related to doing a research question. And they have some reports that they're going to share on graduate debt and earnings and community college baccalaureates. And then I'm finally going to close this out with a brief presentation on some research that Ali Bell and I did related to exploring outcomes in education fields. We used the PSEO Explorer, and we'll share some information and some links in the chat related to this in case you haven't had a chance to take a look at the PSEO Explorer and what the PSEO data provide. So at this point, I'm going to go on mute and I'm going to turn it over to Chase Stahl from the Montana University System, who's going to share information that he was partnered with his colleague Eric Meredith to present and create with Montana University System PSEO data. So over to Chase.
Hello, Gina. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Chase Stahl, as Gina mentioned, and I'm the data specialist for the Montana University System. And I'm going to be presenting some of our dashboards today on behalf of Eric Meredith, who is currently at an airport and unable to hear. So as Gina mentioned, please use the chat box to ask any questions and he'll be able to get those answered to you. So first, I just want to present our primary dashboard that just connects our state level data. So here we have typical for our zip codes, and we're connecting that to our state level NAICS code. So just that it highlights some of the employment flows that we have and very standard filters, and I imagine a pretty common way to display some of the employment flows as well as the median earnings. So we have the time after graduation, year of the degree earned and highest degree attained. And we're also able to disaggregate that by gender, Pell status, race and ethnicity. And so if we focus on the newest dashboard that Eric has developed using PSEO data, we'd see that the purpose of this dashboard is to examine the relationship between the post-secondary education outcomes and labor performance in Montana. By integrating data from the PSEO with student records from the Montana University System and state earnings data from the Montana Department of Labor and Industry, we are better able to understand employment patterns and earnings across the state and nation by degree level, institution, instructional program, and time after graduation. So I'm just going to give a pretty high level overview and a simple analysis. But if we focus our attention on the top portion of this dashboard, this would indicate all of our PSEO data. And here we see the standard quartiles as well as the median earnings displayed in probably a pretty similar format that we're used to. And if we focus our attention on the bottom right-hand screen, you would see our state data in the exact same format. And so one particular use that we have for using this dashboard is you're able to kind of benchmark our state data against that of the PSEO data. So you can see exactly how Montana earnings, median earnings compare to that across the nation. On the left-hand side, we have a heat map that demonstrates the distribution of graduate recipients across these regions. And so we're able to better understand exactly where our students are going. And if you highlight this, you are able to see on that next box, the employed by industry, where these students are employed in. And so I'm just going to do a quick filter, and we're just going to look at the bachelor's degree, and I'll kind of walk you through just a quick interpretation of some of these results. So here we're just looking at the bachelor's degree, and we see we have about 67,000 employed graduates. You can see the earnings quartile, median earnings, and so we're going to focus on that roughly $42,000, and you can see that this is the exact same numbers up here. And so when we look at this, we can also see the percentage of graduate coverage. And this represents the number of records that we have using the PSEO data for those graduates. And as I stated, one key insight that we can derive from this data is that we can look at the median's earnings that we see here, about 42,000, and we can compare that to what our bachelor's degree recipients in the state earn, and we see that's about $41,000. So about a little difference of about $1,000, and you're able to use the various filters to drill down into that data and see time after graduation and see what that looks like across time. On the bottom left, if we hover over this, we can see that the Pacific region has roughly 13% of our bachelor's degree recipients, and moving over to the Mountain Division, about 9.6%. And of course, when you hover over this, you see that region's bachelor recipients and what industry they're employed in. And of course, the key insight in this map is the Montana retention. How many of these bachelor recipients remain in that state 1 year after graduation? So that's just kind of a high-level overview of some of the key insights that we intended to use this dashboard for. And I do want to focus on 3 key challenges that well, not me, Eric had when developing this dashboard. And so one of those was connecting the aggregated data of the PSEO to the MUS student level data. I imagine that might be an important question, one I certainly don't have the answers to and will likely need to get into the weeds, so I'm able to overcome and replicate some of these analysis. Second is the methodology of when we begin tracking earnings. So as Eric was developing this dashboard, we were obviously comparing our state earnings data to that of the PSEO national earnings data. And one thing we found is that dashboard I demonstrated earlier, we begin tracking our earnings 1 year after graduation. So if a student graduated in the spring, we would start tracking that in the May of the following year, and that would be our first one. Whereas I understand the PSEO data starts beginning tracking the following January after graduation. So Eric was able to, when he was going through this, there were some challenges and a little bit of disparities, and so a lot of that was attributed to the methodology. So making sure that you're aligning the methodology by tracking beginning January 1st, and that's something we did not do in our previous dashboard. So that was one challenge. And then lastly, at the bottom left-hand side of the screen, we see Montana, and we know Montana is part of the Mountain Division. And one challenge that Eric had was trying to isolate that data and incorporate that, so we were able to get that the percent of students employed in Montana. So one thing I'm always curious about is to what use cases or utility are some of these dashboards used. And so one way and a common theme that we've discussed throughout some of our calls with the PSEO is that I imagine a lot of legislatures out there would want to make sure that students that are being educated in the state are retained in the state. And also, when we look at this data, we can kind of benchmark and compare some of the median earnings outside of the state and making sure that Montana is competitive and these students aren't necessarily leaving the state to pursue better financial opportunities elsewhere. So this is one way we can get to the bottom of that. And I primarily work with some of our Perkins institutions. And so we recently completed our CLNA, our Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment. And as part of that, we are required to track the employment rates and re-enrollment rates of our programs. And so throughout this process, some of our schools that had rather lower placement and re-enrollment rates, we were able to supplement the labor market data with this dashboard. So we were able to get a better understanding of exactly where or why those students might be going. You're not exactly comparing apples to apples in that scenario, as we look at the 6-digit zip code as well as the cluster level data. But given some of the smaller institutions, it's not terribly difficult to deduce and infer where some of those students might be going or why they might be going, especially if there is disparity between some of the state data median earnings and that of the PSEO data median earnings. And so if you have any questions, please contact Eric, and all credit should be going to Eric. I'm just trying to do some justice for all his hard work. And with that, I'd conclude the presentation and pass it back over to you, Gina, for our next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chase, and what a good colleague, both of you, you and Eric, to work with each other. So, and we can all, realize that there are times when our colleagues are, I won't say stuck in an airport, because I know Eric's in the Seattle airport and there's some good food there, but but thanks so much for both your participation, Eric, virtually. I mean, we're all virtual and remote, but in an airport versus in an office. And thanks so much, Chase, for sharing that information. And I do see that there's a question to have Eric's contact info in the chat, and I'm sure Eric can provide that because he's able to access the chat. And I did also share in the chat that every single one of these presentations that are going to be presented today, information about these dashboards, links to the dashboards, and then as well as the research reports, the reports themselves are available on the PSEO Coalition website in our resource library. And I did share the link to that as well. And Annika shared it again. So it's right up at the top of the chat. So at this point, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Paula Nissen and Vlad Bassis from Iowa, who are going to share about their dashboard that they created using Iowa Community College data. So over to you.
Hello, and thank you, Gina. This is Paula Nissen. I'm with the Institutional Research Collaborative North Central Iowa, but also work in partnership with the Iowa Department of Education. Prior to the PSEO dashboard project implementation, Iowa's community college students have been tracked in annual cohorts for each of 5 years following completion, using state unemployment wage records since about 2006. Often the wage and employment data were unavailable state to state, and comparisons in a meaningful way by program were not really available. And longer term also, was something that we struggled with our historical approach, meaning over the 5-year period. However, through the grant, Iowa developed a process to equalize those results using PSEO for meaningful comparison of programs and wages for each, usually using the data related to unemployment or employment by occupational area in various geographic regions of the state and the country, pertaining to a number of regional factors that impact industry employability and wages. We were successful by combining PSEO data with publicly available data and some subscription sources, and then also utilizing the cost of living index in order to develop a calculation for adjusting the wage data for each program area by state. This approach added accuracy to regional and state comparability using PSEO data and extended the Iowa Community College comparisons to not only 5, but then 10 years following completion. So the integration of PSEO's 10-year employment benchmarking, which was missing from our original student outcomes, will give us the ability to add long-term dimension to existing framework. So additionally, we were able to construct data tables, data visualizations, which my partner in crime, Vlad Bassis, will be showing you shortly, with user-driven filters and programmatic summaries, such as infograph formatting, and then communication. We use it for communication with college partners and constituents across the state of Iowa. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Vlad, and he will steer or drive the machine he created.
Good afternoon. I'm going to get right to our site. It is displayed and all the data in it in a generally supported by state longitudinal data system website, Iowa Student Outcomes. And Iowa Student Outcomes contain all the partners you can see here. We're going to concentrate on Iowa community colleges since that's where our data resides. For credit and non-credit outcomes. And Paula mentioned that we have worked with credit outcomes of our students since long time ago. We're fortunate to have good partnership with our workforce development agency. And so we have all that data in state and out of state through other externals, data suppliers. So as you can see, we can say right on the onset what % of the students employed in Iowa, and it's not just by region, but specifically by a state. So we have that data in particular in what state they are employed, if they're not employed in Iowa type of award, and the smallest distribution actually on the 6-digit zip code out there. So we can actually provide all this data about our programs on the smallest level available out there by type of degree and by any program level. So that is all great. We can track them also from career cluster to industry here. Also see whether they're employed in the program of study actually that they completed. We have trends. But all that is limited, as Paul mentioned already, to only our Iowa Community College and our state. Yes, we know where our graduates go geographically. We know it longitudinally up to 5 years, but PSEO provides the dimension that we never had before. We now can compare, actually, all those students in each program to their nationwide data and to a different college if need comes out there. So that brings additional dimension for our community colleges to benchmark themselves, not only within the state, but what's important, outside of the state of Iowa. As a state, again, as a particular college to college, and as a particular program to program cluster. So it starts with a data set, and as Paul mentioned, it's very important to adjust these numbers, the earnings especially, to some common denominator. We selected cost of living index, and so that these wages are more comparable, not at face value, but adjusted to the cost of living. Unfortunately, the smallest geographical denomination that these data are available nationwide is state. We would love to know in more details, if possible, by county, because we see, and I'm sure everybody experienced the same, significant deviations within the state, depending on geography, depending on many factors. But unfortunately, we cannot plug those in. There is no nationwide data that would support it. But even supporting this adjustment on the state level provides very, very insightful conclusions that we can see how the adjusted wages are comparable across the nation out there. So this beginning of the show is really interesting to see what states participate And we limited this only to community colleges, of course, because that's what we run as the data team here at the Iowa Department of Education. So Board of Regents, four-year institutions are not included nationwide. It's just community colleges to community colleges comparison. But you can see at a glance what states participated, and in particular, providing associate degrees, at least for community colleges. For all cohorts, it's interesting that historical views can provide how some states joined and how it was growing with time. Every new cohort has some additions, even though, of course, there are limitations, because for this cohort, 10 years is not available yet. But if we switch to 1 year, again, you can see this progress. And sometimes an interesting picture when some state join and then leave, like Pennsylvania. I'm not sure what's the reason. Perhaps the data was too small cells available for a display or something else, but I found that it's interesting that they appear and reappear on some occasions for certain cohorts. So that's the general comparison of state to state, so to speak, the general view. The more important view after this general is an actual dashboard. So as you can see from the legend, it presents a three-way comparison on all occasions. So the horizontal bar presents whatever is the entity. In this case, it's the whole state of Iowa. The vertical bar presents the state numbers. And of course, at this time, because we're looking not at a college, but Iowa as a state, it is the same at this point. And the star represents the national numbers for the comparison. So if I select a specific college in Iowa, now you will see all three-way comparison. So this happens to be Northeast Iowa Community College. And you can see wages, they're all adjusted again for the state as they are 1 year after graduation. So compared to statewide in community colleges, compared to national everywhere. So this way, it's easy to establish this comparison right away from this dashboard. And of course, it's tracking students just like PSEO does 1 year, 5 years, and 10 years after graduation. Descending on the program level, of course, for that, I would need to select 2 or 4 SIP digit aggregations. Let's say I'll start big with the big ones, right? And at this point, it will show me only programs on two-digit SIP levels in Northeast Iowa community colleges. So I select the construction trades, and I see that small certificates under 1 year are not available. That's possible that the college doesn't offer them, but associate degrees and 1 to 2 year certificates are available in construction trades. If I change the college, I will probably, let's select the largest one, which is Des Moines Area Community College. It does have in construction trades as well, but only on the level of certificates 1 to 2 years. And as already mentioned, I have a three-way comparison immediately. I can select something outside of Iowa. Go back to all. And reset filters. Then I will be able to see any community college participating in PSEO for any of these time periods in a different state. So if I'm interested in comparing my college to one in Texas, then I can again get all Texas colleges, community colleges that participate in this data set selected. And at that point, hopefully, I know what's more meaningful for my comparison of my college to any other college. And I can go down to a specific program that I might be interested in. Doesn't happen to have that construction trades, but let's say I'm interested in precision production. So I can see how my colleagues in Eastfield College in Texas do, again, in three-way comparison by their state, by the national, and between their college and national as well. So that's the essence of it. It's possible why we have this arrangement that is technically one long page is because we would like the users also to have portability of the stuff. So it is arranged so, which is not that simple for Tableau. That's why this specific design that it can be downloaded as a static, whichever is your final view that you would like to download. You can download as a static PDF document, and on all occasions it will be presented as one pager, like front and back, right? And in this way, it can be further distributed to whatever audience is needed. So that's an additional intent of it. Obviously, the user can also download the full data set if they would like to continue with some other data points. This data set can be downloaded and used respectively later with all of our numbers plugged in, meaning adjusted wages and everything else that is present in the PSEO with our adjusted numbers. So data set can be used as well for further research. This is in short about the site and the new addition to our program outcomes, PSEO. And with that, I will conclude my presentation and get open for questions.
Fabulous. Thank you, Vlad and Paula. And once again, the chat is open to questions, so feel free to place those in. While we're waiting to see if there's some questions, I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple because I know it's been fun seeing this project from proposal to completion and then beyond, and now seeing your presentation. One of the things I'm curious about is, did you all have a specific audience in mind for this, or is it more of a philosophy of we know these data are interesting, and then anyone can use these data, especially anyone in Iowa? I'm just curious about that. And second part of that question, have you done outreach to specific audiences at all to let them know that it's available?
I'll start with the history, Paul. You might continue. The history is that community colleges needed it for not only program planning or better feedback for their programs, but also to see a general picture of employment for their graduates out there. So that was very important. We very quickly found out that sometimes legislators use it as well, because as close to return on investment as it could be, it just lacks a component of what has been used for education out there. But otherwise, it contains that. We hope the general public also been using it. But any specific examples, Paul, that you might think of?
Well, I can tell you that Iowa is not usually a state where someone wants to stay for the rest of their life unless they're in their, later years to settle down and raise a family. So many times our students in the colleges will say, I'll get training with, for this, and I'll go out to California. No offense to California. And I'll make 10 times the amount of money that I would in Iowa. So with this, it gives us the availability to say, yeah, you might be making more, but the cost of living there is more. And here's what it equals out to when you take the cost of living into consideration. It gives us talking points to not only the students, but also the constituents. So that helps a lot in those conversations.
That's great. And to have it available in multiple ways, like you showed,
Yes.
to be able to pull it as a one pager as well. There is a question in the chat I'm going to raise up. Can you speak to the link to actual occupation students end up in and full-time or part-time employment rather than broad clusters or assumptions based on proxy or wage inferences? I know there was a point, Vlad, where you mentioned that you can see if they're in a field that they studied. Can you talk, that might not be the PSEO part of it, but it's part of your dashboard. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Paula worked for many, many years in workforce development and in Department of Education, and she knows a lot about it and about our pain related to occupations and other smaller details that we don't have.
Well, I can tell you that in the UI wage records in Iowa, and it's not the case across the nation, but we do not have number of hours, so there's no way to tell full or part-time. We also do not know what occupation, because that's not included either, but we do have the ability to identify the industry and make some assumptions based on wages from the BLS and other sources to take a good look at where the folks are working and what they're making, and using staffing patterns to give some justification to the fact that they may or probably are working in the trade in which they've done their training in. For example, even though they're working in retail, they may be making $72,000 a year, most likely working in the pharmacy as that pharmacy tech that they studied for. That's just one example that's out there. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, and I would add another piece that we really would love to have, and it's not collected precisely in our workforce data by our colleagues out there, is a precise location of the business of employment. What we have currently with UI records is, well, where the check is coming from. That is headquarters, and headquarters can be elsewhere, not necessarily in that place. It creates certain problems. For example, one of our dashboards displays the distribution per capita of nurses, licensed nurses in each county. And then the question was, how come that we have so many of them actually? And I know for a fact that we actually underserve our population in my rural county. Oh, that's because it's not where they live that they earn somewhere else. And sometimes it involves traveling to another county. So we did all we could with extrapolation of their actual place of work versus their place of living out there, and it shows an entirely different picture. But we would love to have a precise location to answer that question precisely.
Now, I do a lot of crosswalking of the data for the community colleges as well. So there is the ability to crosswalk those programs into occupations that are of similar nature. So you can figure out what occupations would be associated with the training programs at the community colleges. But that's a separate issue too. All right.
Yeah, thanks so much for this. And in the chat, folks are sharing that it is, of course, different in different states. So
yes,
Brian, we can't all be South Carolina, but we're trying in the unemployment insurance. But
would you have your legislators talk to our legislators?
I was going to say, the really cool thing is that's why we do things like this, right? We get together and we learn from each other. So we can get some ideas, and we can say, look what they're doing over there or there, and get some ideas. So thanks, yeah, and thanks, John. We love the work that Strata is doing in this area as well, and partnering with them to try and get more and more rich data to answer these questions. So a couple more questions, and then we're going to share the University of Utah. As we said, that one was pre-recorded because Abby is on parental leave, which is very exciting. But she was kind enough to record this before she went on leave. So a couple other questions. One, when you were showing the dashboard, you used obviously the levels of credentials that are in the PSEO when you're showing the PSEO piece, and the level of credentials. And so those begin with less than 1 year certificates, and then they go all the way up in the data set to PhD. Not that that's at the community college level, but curious about, I know there's some work in Iowa related to non-credit. It's not in the PSEO data set yet, but how are you thinking about those data, and yeah, how to use data like that and track the outcomes of your non-credit students and graduates?
First off, we do have non-credit student into workforce tracking system. And again, it is similar to the credit for community colleges, at least in Iowa. So we have the data. We have all detailed data on enrollments and completions on non-credit side as well. So we would love to have it actually in PSEO as well, so we know not only for our own state, but also a comparison in different colleges that provide valuable non-credit programs to their students and their pathways outside of Iowa. So as you're actually very good with the question, whoever asked it, so that we can actually dream of introducing non-credit data into PSEO. And the first step to make this dream true is that Iowa will submit all community college data, non-credit data as of upcoming year to PSEO in a way to build some sort of experimental database to see how it can plug in into currently available credit outcomes through PSEO. And hopefully, if it works, other states will join us, share their non-credit data, and we will have the first in history comparative non-credit data sets for out-of-state comparisons for each state and each college.
We've been doing this work since about 2015, 2016. So our non-credit analysis and student outcomes work is on the website, the same website that Vlad showed for the PSEO project. It's there, but we would love to expand upon that and be able to do comparisons across states. Absolutely. And we do measure before, during, and after for non-credit, which I think would be really good to see too.
Thank you. So you don't yet have what you want in your UI records, but you're ahead of the game in your non-credit. So this
We're
is why,
making do with
again,
what we have.
yeah, this is why, again, it's really cool for us all to be talking
Let's
to
go,
each other.
John. You can push that through. That'd be awesome.
Okay, one last question, and then we'll share the University of Utah version so folks can see that one as well. One other thing that's coming up a lot right now, especially with OB3 legislation and pieces, is thinking about the ROI at the program level. Any thoughts on how this dashboard or these data are helpful for you all in that kind of measurement? Because this is available at the program level, right?
Right. Yeah, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Because in fact, our colleagues on a four-year institution, public border regions institutions already built a system that actually allows, and it uses PSEO in particular, allows for some robust return on investment on program level tracking. We are going to use the same method basically, and very soon build our own return on investment based on PSEO data out there. Hard to overestimate the use of it because we use the same methodology statewide this way for border regions that don't have that much access compared to community colleges to workforce outcomes. But PSEO helps us to be on the same page and build this based on solid methodology.
Fantastic. Thank you both again. Congratulations to you for getting this research grant. It was kind of a, fantastic proposal. So
Thank you very much. We appreciate it too.
yeah, I am going to share my screen, and we have tested this, so cross fingers for technology to work, to play the presentation and the demonstration of the University of Utah's dashboard. It's about 7 minutes long. So we'll share this. Abby Ross is going to take us through what the University of Utah did with their PSEO data. And I'm going to share sound and share screen. And then I'll need a thumbs up from someone that this is working once I hit play.
Hi there, my name is Abby Ross, and I work at the University of Utah in the University Analytics and Institutional Reporting Office. I will be presenting our office's work on the PSEO grant today virtually, so thank you for your patience. Special thanks to Nathan Zicksmith on our team who helped with the dashboard. Thanks to the Texas Higher Education Foundation and PSEO for their financial support of this project. At the University of Utah, we use PSEO data in many internal dashboards, but for this project, we were hoping to use them in an external dashboard. Our goal here was to increase transparency in higher ed by creating a comparison tool that's publicly available on our University of Utah website for prospective students to compare income earnings by zip code between institutions, or to compare one institution to a group like the AAU, the R1s, or the Utah System of Higher Education. We've also made this dashboard generic enough that any institution in those groups could put it on their website as is. And additionally, we've provided data downloads for each of those groups so that if you're a member of the AAU or the R1 or the USHE system, you could download that specific data and build a dashboard like ours very simply with the PSEO data, but just already organized and cleaned nicely. So today I will show you the dashboard that we created and a little bit of how to use it, and then I'll show you how to get those data downloads. I'll start by sharing my screen and showing the PSEO research webpage, which has tons of resources with research from the PSEO grants as well as from people who work within PSEO. And ours you can find here, the University of Utah PSEO Earnings Data Comparison Tool. If you click on that, you get a few different options here. The overview links to our paper with all of our findings and our process of what we did. And then these are the data downloads. So we'll start with the paper. I encourage you to read it if this is something that interests you. But on the top of page 2, right here, you can find our dashboard. So our dashboard is really simple. It's just one page with a few filters. The way this works is that you can choose a degree level, bachelor's with different outcome comparison cohorts, master's or doctorate. You can select a different major. You could select all, you could select a couple, you could select one. And then you can choose a primary institution or group, as well as a comparison institution or group. So right now we're comparing bachelor's degrees outcomes to all majors, comparing the University of Utah on the top to the whole AAU schools, all the AAU schools on the bottom. This is all the AAU schools that provide data to the PSEO. So not all states provide their data, but every institution that is part of that partnership is here. So the way that this tool works is that you can see a zip code across the top. We start with accounting and related services. At the University of Utah, there's 327 students in that 2019 to 2021 bachelor's cohort. And we have the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentiles, as well as the dotted line is the average for that zip code. And the gray bars, this like wider gray bar, is all SIPs, 25 and 75th percentiles. And what you see here is you can compare the University of Utah at that zip code to all AAU schools at that zip code for earnings outcomes. You'll see that the University of Utah doesn't have aerospace and aeronautical engineering, and so it won't show up here. But any SIP that both schools do offer will be shown there. So just a couple of examples. Maybe you're a student and you want to study economics. You could do a search. And you're interested in the University of Utah or maybe University of Colorado Boulder. You're trying to decide between the two. And so you're interested in comparing outcomes for them. You'll see, okay, econ, this is how many graduates we have, very similar in those cohorts. And these are the earnings outcomes for those students. Maybe you actually are interested in the University of Virginia compared to the University of Colorado Boulder. It doesn't have to relate to the University of Utah in any way. And then you can see outcomes for this SIP, or maybe there's actually a few different things you're interested in studying and you want to compare across all of those. So really useful tool to just simply and quickly show you a outcomes comparison. Additionally, you can compare to a group like the University of Virginia to the whole of the AAU like we had before, or maybe you're interested in comparing all of the R1 schools on top to all of the AAU schools down here on the bottom. And you can compare those as well. This dashboard has been available on our website at the University of Utah's data website for about a month, and it has over 450 views so far, which are from guests, which is people who don't work in our office. And so it's been great to see a one step in the right direction towards some transparency in earnings outcomes across zip codes and across institutions. Now, if you're interested in downloading this data yourself, you can go back to the PSEO website, click on one of these downloads, and it will prompt a download. Once you click on that, I will share the Excel that will pop up. And this is the Utah System of Higher Education one. So we have Dixie State University as the University of Utah, all the different Utah System of Higher Ed schools in here. It's all just the PSEO data, but it's been formatted to ignore the schools that aren't in that group and only include the schools that are in that group, which might be helpful for you if you're interested in creating a comparison tool like this. So reach out if you have any questions at all. I'm happy to share our work, share our data. It's the PSEO's data, so thank you, PSEO and the U.S. Census Bureau, for providing that data for us. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Feel free to reach out. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Fabulous. Thanks for that. It's always fun to see people in the past, I guess, because again, Abby was very kind to record that before she went on leave. So, and I also love that she walked you through on the video how to access it. Again, we shared the link to the resource library, and I know the links were shared in here for all of the resources as well. So we, at this point in time, are going to have a brief intermission. We're going to stop until the top of the hour, whatever your time zone is, so people can stretch and fill their water bottles. I live in Colorado, so we're all about water bottles and hydrating. And we are going to come back at the top of the hour. In the meantime, we have some informational slides that are going to be on display. So if you want to just leave this up on your screen and take a break and stay on mute, feel free. If you do leave and want to come back, or accidentally leave and want to come back, you can just use the same link. The link will be available for the whole rest of the hour. So when we come back on the hour, we will go ahead and learn more about the research topics and the reports that folks have shared. So we'll see you in about 12 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, or welcome to, it looks like we had a few folks join us for this second half of our virtual showcase. And thank you to those of you who have stayed to see our entire virtual showcase. We're very excited to show you some materials that we have. So we are just very briefly, for those who just joined us, just want to mention that this is our second virtual showcase of 2025. We're hoping to hold many of these in the future. We'd like to hold at least a couple a year to showcase some of the work that we've been doing related to PSEO data. And we wanted to thank and acknowledge our generous sponsor, the Strata Education Foundation, for their funding to help us hold these showcases and to help us provide the research grants that were awarded that we are featuring today. And so, as we mentioned previously, we had a competitive process, and these 5 being featured today, the 3 dashboards that were already presented, and 2 of the 3 research projects that are going to be shared in this next hour were funded as part of our research grant program. So thank you for that. And one thing we want to do is touch really quickly on who is going to be presenting or what is going to be presented in this next hour. And so we are going to start with CJ Lawasi, representing the group that studied graduate debt and earnings. And so I'll turn it over to CJ in a moment. And then we're going to touch on a group that studied community college baccalaureates and used PSEO data to explore that. And that will be represented by Kalina Cortez, Camila Morales, and Julia Turner. And then the last one was not part of the research grant process, but we thought this would be a good timing to share this as well, because it was done kind of in parallel time frame. A researcher, Ali Bell, and I conducted some research using just the PSEO Explorer tool, and we'll talk about how that works on exploring outcomes in education fields. And so that'll be the final piece that we do today. As before, please feel free to use the chat function to ask questions. In some cases, there are multiple presenters. One person will be presenting, but another person who knows the answers, because they also were a researcher on this project, and so they might be able to answer right in the chat, and we also will pause at the end of each presentation and offer some time for question and answer as well. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so CJ can share the screen and turn it over to you. Thanks, CJ.
Thank you. Let me see if I can actually get everything where I need it to be. So I'm looking at the screen. All right, let's see here. You all can see my screen, is that right? All right. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be with you all. So nice to be talking to everybody here. Such a nice big group, and it'll be fun to talk about. So we're going to shift gears a little bit, I think, just as Gina was saying, into the research mode. And I want to show you some work that we did as part of this grant program. And thanks again to PSEO and Strata for their support of all this stuff. The work that we did is on graduate school debt and earnings. And I did, Julia and I did this. Julia's at Northwestern, I'm at Teachers College, and Julia is also on the next paper because she just loves PSEO so much. And so we are just really excited to get to do this work. I'm going to sort of split it between the substance of the findings, the research findings, and then sort of the process, just because I think that would be useful and interesting to PSEO users in general. And so so my thought was we could talk about both, but if people have questions about either or want me to pause on either, feel free to interrupt me and tell me, say more about that or say less about that, whatever floats your boat. But yeah, don't feel like you need to hesitate. And Julia's here, so possibly monitoring the chat too. I'll try to keep an eye on it as well, but feel free to interrupt with questions. Okay, so the basic thing that we worked on was graduate school debt and earnings. Graduate school is a big deal lately, I would say, especially with the most recent I don't know what we're calling it, OBA or something, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which changed a fair amount it changed many things in the United States, but it changed a fair amount specifically in graduate school because it changed the graduate loan limits. This is a thing that's been on the radar of policymakers for a long time because sort of before this point, there had been no graduate loan limits functionally. The limit was as much as it cost, as much as the school cost, you could borrow up to that, basically. And as a result, graduate debt has been on the rise. So a lot of the big numbers, eye-popping numbers that you hear about student debt in general are often about graduate school. So, the big six-figure debt loads are most often in graduate school. If you read deeply on the New York Times coverage of these types of things, profiles of students with that sort of debt, it's like often somebody with a master's in theater or something like that from an expensive school, and graduate school is a big driver of debt. But up until lately, we hadn't really had program level debt at the for graduate school programs. The college scorecard for undergraduate field of study does have a fair amount of debt data, program level debt data, and program level earnings data. But until recently, it hadn't been possible to do that with graduate debt. I spent some time in the Biden administration at the Office of the Chief Economist in the Department of Education, and at the same time, Julia was at the White House. And during that time, we worked on some graduate debt proposals that required us to pull data together to understand graduate debt at the program level. And so, as a part of our time there, we released that data along with some reports. If folks are interested in where that data is, it's all at the program level. I can provide links once I'm done presenting. But let me know if you're interested. But anyway, that data was available and out there. And then when we saw this proposal, we thought that combining it with the PSEO data, which has amazing earnings data, would be a good idea because often the question in evaluating the quality or the prudence of going to a specific graduate program is do the earnings justify the debt load, basically? But that's a hard question to answer for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is that we didn't have great debt data. The other reason is we often only have sort of limited earnings data. So we have earnings data pretty quickly, 2 years, 3 years after school, after people graduate, but we don't have it over the longer term. But of course, the beauty of PSEO is that it does have it over a longer period of time. And so for a select, we saw an opportunity as a part of this grant program to sort of combine the two sources. So this sort of newly available debt data and the longer term earnings data available through PSEO, both at the program level. This is, we talk about it as graduate debt generally, but specifically for PSEO, the program level data is best sort of at the 4-digit level. That's the thing that's sort of most recognizable as a field of study. 2-digit is a little bit more broad and includes sort of more diverse set of subfields within a broader category. And so we do this specifically for professional programs. That's like graduate programs that are preparing you for a specific job: law, medicine, DPT, physical therapy, things like that, are all professional programs of study. So we have a bunch of different fields, and we wanted to just try to give a sense of a longer, full understanding of you're going to take out a certain amount of debt, and then you're also going to get a certain amount of earnings over your life as a result of that. And so we want to try to get a full picture of those things. And we think PSEO provides the ability to do that. Okay, that's a long throat clearing thing. But this is the way that we do it. So two things that PSEO allows us to do that are really great. One is to go longer, as I was saying, so go out to 10 years. The other is to be able to go beyond just typical, right? So beyond just the average students. We have, the central tendency of this distribution is the median, but we also have 25th and 75th percentile. So we can see, students who do a little bit worse than average and students who do a little bit better than average as well. And so, okay, there's a bunch of cohorts available, and but what we're going to do is we're going to try to combine the overlapping cohorts with some complications that will be the basis of the information that I'm going to provide about our process and how we went through our process. But suffice it to say that we're going to combine the PSEO data with the Department of Education data. We're going to try to make it for the kind of closely overlapping cohorts of the 2016 through 2019 in the Department of Education data and 2016 through 2020 in the PSEO data. Not exactly perfect, but pretty good. And then we're going to try to look at all the earnings farther out. Okay, so let's just start with the earnings. PSEO can tell you this alone without combining it with anything else, and it's interesting in and of itself. So these are the graduate field programs of study that we're going to look at, and this is the 5-year earnings in blue. So we have the interquartile range, the 25th percentile through the 75th percentile, and the median is marked in the middle lines. And I think the main takeaway from this graph is kind of the awooga of oh my God, medicine earnings is so big and it grows so fast. Medicine is really interesting because it has very steep growth. Residents don't make a lot of money right out of school, but that generally is where people are when we're talking about 1, 2, 3 years out. But by the time you get to 5 years out, my understanding is, with the exception of sort of some super long residencies or some weird edge cases, most people are out of residency, and so you start to see the earnings rise. And by 10 years out, you really have people sort of in the prime of their earnings, earning full physician salaries. Dentists also make a lot of money. I mean, these are all, so this line starts at $100,000, so very high up in the national income distribution for the United States. But basically earnings are pretty high for all of these graduate professional programs. But they're really, really high for medicine. But the question is, medicine also has a lot of debt. So how do these things compare? But the other thing we want to show is, so this is for the fields overall. But the other thing we wanted to use about the PSEO data is that it has it at the program level. So we can show you program level variation in how much earnings there is. And there's a ton. There's so much earnings variation. So this is for dentistry, a bunch of different dentistry programs. And I'm just going to show you just a couple of contrasts. We've put a bunch of different earnings distributions in our report, and I can point you to that for more. But I just wanted to show you some contrasts here, which is one where you see a lot of differences across programs in the field of study and the earnings trajectories. When people go from 1 to 5 to 10 years of earnings, the growth is upward for all of them and steeper in the 1 to 5 year area. But for different programs, it works kind of differently. Some of them are really steep at the beginning and flatten or go down by 10 years, and others are pretty steady along the way, and all of those different things in between. You can choose your favorite PSEO represented university with a dentistry program and look at its trajectory if you feel so inclined. But I want to compare this with veterinary medicine, where kind of everybody's trajectory is very similar. If you were to look at the slope of these lines, they're pretty much the same. And so it's interesting that just like there's some fields where things seem kind of regimented and earnings are pretty steady for everybody. And if you graduate into that field, it seems like if you become a vet, the levels are different across programs. Some vet programs earn a lot, like Texas A&M, I think quite a famous veterinary, place where people are taking care of expensive horses. I don't know, earning a lot of money. But the trajectory over the life course, the growth over the life course, at least for the first decade after graduation, seems pretty consistent across fields. So that capturing that sort of variation is another really nice part of the PSEO data. But then we wanted to compare it to the debt. And so what I wanted to do was walk you through this graph and then kind of show you how we got there, because there was just some data maneuvering that we had to do that I think is interesting for PSEO users. So what this shows us is each dot here is a program, and the type of dot, the shape and the color tells you what field of study it's in. And all we're doing is we're comparing the median program debt. So that's from the Department of Education data. How much does a graduate accrue in graduate debt from these fields over the course of their time in that program? And then we compare that to how much earnings do you get total. So if we sum across the 10 years that are between when you graduate and when you reach a decade out of school. If we sum up those earnings, and then we just plot these, we're going to scatter plot them against each other. What does that look like? A couple things to notice. One is that the scales are different on the X and Y axis. So the Y axis is about 10 times as large as the X axis. And so that's important for interpreting, both the how far apart things are from each other and just for what's the ratio. But I think the takeaway there is that kind of like in a lot of these fields, total earnings over that first decade are about 10 times the amount of debt. So even though there are very alarming debt levels, earnings easily outstrip the debt, at least for professional programs, these professional programs. The other is that you see some like kind of obvious clustering, right? Where there's sort of just fields kind of work similarly. Now, there's a lot of variation within those fields. Some fields, like, for example, veterinary medicine, we were talking about how kind of similar the earnings look, and yet the debts are really dispersed. The very different story when you talk about law. In particular, law has a ton of different earnings levels and a ton of different debt levels, and then it has these like elite schools, the top 10 or 15, depending on who you hear talking about law school as like the key places that are feeders to big law firms. And those schools earn way different. Like the people who, if you're at a big law firm, your earnings look more like a physician than they do look like the rest of the law. And your debt levels are a bit higher, but not proportionally so, really. And so that's sort of interesting. These are in our data, like UVA, University of Texas, and one other that's escaping me. But in any case, those are sort of the elite law schools in the data. So it's sort of interesting to dig through. But the thing I want to point to is that this is actually trickier to do than it looks. One is that we know that we only have, let me just show you this. So we make the cohorts align, but as folks were saying in the first thing, there's a lot of missing data in the PSEO data, especially for more recent years, because there just hasn't been enough time elapsed to have gotten 10 years of earnings yet from some of the cohorts. So for some of the people in the 2016 through 2020 cohort, there's just not enough years that have elapsed in between for us to have earnings data for those. And so we have to figure out if we want to make the cohorts align so that we have the debt data matching the same sort of program people as the earnings data, we need to figure out something to do with the earnings, take a reasonable approach to impute earnings for those people. We could use older earnings from older cohorts, but that seemed a little less satisfactory than trying to make good judgments based on the information we do have. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And then the other thing is that we only have 1, 5, and 10-year earnings. And so so we need to, if I told you I added up all the earnings in between, we need to figure out what earnings look like in year 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. And what we do there is just a very simple linear interpolation, but I'll say more about that in a second. So, all right, so how did we get from programs where we have 1-year earnings but no 5 or 10-year earnings to filling in those 5 or 10-year earnings? So the intuition that we used was basically that in previous cohorts, we know what the relationship between 1, 5, and 10-year earnings is for specific programs and in specific fields of study. And so we're just going to use those relationships that we observe and do that with a regression to take the same relationship for the same fields of study and earnings percentiles and time horizons, and try to use those relationships to take the information we do have. So in the 2016 through 2020 cohort, we have 1-year earnings, and we know what field of study you're in and what institution you're at and all that sort of stuff. And we're going to use also some lag predictors, so we know what that institution's earnings were in the previous cohort, the previous 2 cohorts, and we're going to put that all in a regression, and we're going to predict what your earnings look like. Would look like going forward. Now, you might say, like, how good is that? Is that a good prediction of what the earnings would be? So what we did to try to validate that was we looked at in years where we do have that data. So let's pretend in the 2006 through 2010 data, we have 5-year earnings there and 10-year earnings, but let's pretend we didn't have it. And let's use this procedure to predict those earnings and see how they look. And that's what I'm scatter plotting here. It's just the predicted earnings versus the true earnings for all of the programs in the data. And they are pretty good. This is like a 0.85, 0.9 R squared. So that predicts it pretty well. And just sort of you can take your pick about whether these look reasonable to you in terms of this is the line that runs through the middle is the 45-degree line where the two would be exactly perfectly predicted, right? And then you can do the same thing for the 10-year earnings, and they also look pretty close. And so we felt reasonably comfortable with that. We're imputing those as like a decent approximation. And then for the in-between, all we're doing is drawing a straight line between the different segments. So we know 1 and 5, so we draw a straight line between 1 and 5, and we know 5 and 10, we draw a separate straight line between 5 and 10. That allows things to happen like earnings going up, but then going down, as we do see in some fields. And then we just sum across those. That's maybe a strong assumption in some cases. Sometimes the earnings are curved up or curved down, and we may miss some earnings in those places. But given the ratio of the debts to the earnings, earnings are something like 7 to 10 times the debt amounts. We think these sorts of errors are not going to get the broad magnitude story wrong. They're going to tell us that we have a very, very large ratio of earnings to debt, and that's just over the first 10 years. If you then figure out the rest of people's careers, it's not such a gloomy story that people's earnings are very, at least in these professional programs, the ones that we cover in PSEO, and in professional it might be a different story in master's programs, or it might be a different story in particular professional programs that we don't cover, or professional programs outside of this, or doctoral programs, or whatever the case may be. But at least in these programs, it's quite favorable. The earnings returns seem to be high. Not all of those earnings returns are causal, of course. Some of these earnings people would have gotten anyway. But from a basic sort of consumer protection perspective, like, do people have the money to pay their student loan bills? In these cases, it looks like that's roughly the case. Obviously, people have other expenses, but to a first approximation, it doesn't seem to give too much reason for concern. So if I go back to this graph again, you can see now that the total sum of the earnings here is the thing that took some data work to do, which was, first of all, projecting the earnings for the most recent cohort based on the past cohort relationship between the earnings, and then also interpolating between the points to make sure that we sort of guesstimated at the 5 and 10 year, the earnings between 1 and 5 and 5 and 10 years. Okay, but I think that's all we've got, and I'm happy to, I don't know, Gina, if you want me to just kick it back to you or wait for questions later.
Yeah, thanks so much, CJ.
Yeah.
This was fantastic. I really love to see PSEO data made real like this. And so, and it's fantastic to see this. So what I'm going to do, I see there is a question in the chat. What I'm actually going to do, because of time purposes, is I'm going to turn it over to our team that's presenting on community college baccalaureates. And I know, CJ, you have access to the chat. So if you wouldn't mind, while they start their presentation, answering that question as well as you can typing, we can always have you come off mute afterwards, but that would be perfect. And I'm going to turn it over to Julia, Camila, and I'm not sure. Yep,
Yes,
there we go.
It is. Let
Awesome.
me share my screen here.
Thank you.
Make sure you all hear me well.
Yep, we can see it and we can hear you just fine. So thanks for that, Camila.
Wonderful. Okay, great. So thank you so much. I'm Camila Morales. I'm an assistant professor of economics at UTD. First, I want to thank the PSEO Coalition and the Texas Higher Education Foundation for supporting our research and inviting us to present our work today. The project I will be presenting examines earnings associated with completing a community college baccalaureate degree, which I'll be referring to as a CCB from now on. And we assessed how the earnings of getting a CCB compares to earning an associate's degree versus that of the earnings associated with traditional bachelors from four-year institutions. This project is a joint effort with Riley Acton, Clena Cortez, Lois Miller, and Julia Turner. Julia is actually in the call here with us, and she'll be fielding questions in the chat if you have them there. And then during the Q&A, she'll also be happy to answer your questions. Our research is largely motivated by the notable rise of the community college baccalaureate degree in the past 2 decades. So the share of community colleges that offered CCBs in 2008 was just over 2.5%. By 2022, about 15% of community colleges nationwide offered a CCB. Alongside the growth in CCB offerings, we've also seen a notable increase in CCBs awarded. By 2022, about 15,000 CCBs were awarded nationwide. The growth of CCB programs is not confined to a particular region or a handful of states. Rather, it's been widespread across the country, with about 24 states offering at least one CCB as of 2022. As we see in this map, there is also significant variation in the prevalence of CCB offerings across states. In a state like Ohio, for example, at least half of community colleges offer a CCB degree, whereas in other states, say in Texas, this percent falls between 30 to 40%. Some states that do not currently offer CCBs are actually actively considering legislation to authorize the offering of this degree. This is true in places like Illinois and Iowa, which again just really underscores the policy relevance of our study here. Now, despite the rapid proliferation of the CCB degree, what we know about the labor market returns associated with earning this degree is quite limited. Part of this is that the CCB offerings they've been introduced relatively recently, which leads to limited data. This is actually something that accessing the PSEO data allows us to circumvent. We're able to see the outcomes of CCB graduates across many states and over a long period of time. What we do know about the outcomes of CCB completers comes from descriptive evidence that has been focused on just 3 states, Florida, Washington, and California, where researchers there have documented there are strong average earnings associated with earning a CCB relative to an associate's degree. And while these are important analyses on their own, there continues to be a need for a more comprehensive study on the labor market outcomes of CCB completers, which is exactly what we aim to do with this paper. We leverage PSEO records to conduct the first national study of CCB graduate labor market outcomes, specifically focusing on earnings and making comparisons to both the earnings that are obtained, the earnings associated with completing an associate's, as well as the earnings of those that graduate with a traditional bachelor's degree. Our analysis is going to rely on a series of multivariate regressions, where we leverage variant sets of control variables to make key comparisons across graduates. For example, when we're comparing earnings between associate degree holders and CCB completers, we're going to limit comparisons to graduates who received their degree from the same college and field of study. Some earn an associate's, others earn a CCB, and we're going to document what those earning differences are. Similarly, when we're making comparisons between CCB and traditional BA graduates, we're going to control for state in which these individuals graduate and their field of study, so that we're making comparisons between individuals who graduate from the same state, the same field. Some get a bachelor's from a community college, others from a 4-year institution, and again, we document what those differences are. I want to emphasize here that our study is descriptive in nature, and a lot more work is needed to better understand the causal underpinnings of the relationship we describe in our paper. Here, pause to do a quick plug to say that the same research team that conducted this study is currently running an audit study to begin to understand what those causal relationships are and how the CCB degree is viewed in the labor market. Okay, back to this paper. Our data, or our study, leverages 2 data sources. Our primary source is the PSEO earnings data, which offers aggregate wages by institution, degree, SIP, and cohort levels, reported as median earnings, as well as earnings at the 25th and 75th percentiles. We draw on data covering over 20 years, and to maximize our sample size, our analysis is limited to earnings that are observed during the first year following degree completion. to the PSEO earnings data, we're going to merge information that we obtained from IPEDS, where we are gathering information at the institution level, describing institutional characteristics such as location, as well as types and number of degrees conferred at the institution. By merging IPEDS records, this enables us to identify CCB programs in the PSEO records. We define a bachelor's degree, or we define a CCB degree as one conferred by a public institution that predominantly awards degrees below a bachelor's. So if an institution predominantly awards associates and certificates, and sometimes also awards bachelor's, those bachelor's will be accounted as a CCB program. Okay, first, let me describe the number and types of CCB programs that we identify in the PSEO data using this definition. From the PSEO records, we identified 108 CCB programs across 10 states. This map summarizes kind of the number of programs across states that we're able to identify programs that are also states that participate in the PSEO database. We document a high concentration of CCB programs and graduates in states like Georgia, where we identify 43 programs and nearly 4,000 graduates. Similarly, in Texas, we identified 20 programs and just over 3,000 graduates. Often, CCB programs are viewed as a mechanism for meeting local labor shortages in specific fields. And so they're offered across a variety of fields, which we also identify and represent here in the PSEO data. We see CCBs being awarded in fields like criminal justice, computer information systems, as well as few health-related fields. In fact, nursing is among the fields with a high number of CCB graduates, second to business, which is the most popular CCB in the PSEO records and the one with the most graduates. In the results that I'll begin to summarize in the next slide, we will be presenting earnings differences between CCB degree and other post-secondary credentials, both in the aggregate, but also separately by fields of study, some of which are represented here in this graph. Now on to the results. First, we are going to consider differences in median earnings between completing an associate's over completing a CCB. The first column, which I've highlighted here in green, shows the raw difference where we see that CCB graduates see an earnings advantage over completing an associate's by about $5,600, which corresponds to a 13.8% increase over median earnings. As I explained in a few slides ago, we want to be very cautious about the types of comparisons that we're making. And so we consistently kind of add more control variables, more fixed effects, where in our preferred specification, we include SIP by institution fixed effects. So again, we're limiting comparisons to graduates from the same institution, the same field of study. Some earn an associate's, others earn a BA in that same field. With this more restrictive kind of comparison group, we again find this moderately sized earnings premium of roughly $5,700, corresponding to a 14% increase in median earnings. We also find notable differences in the premia across the income distribution. We find that earning a CCB compared to an associate's results in a slightly smaller premium among lower earners by approximately $4,300. Among higher earners, that advantage over an AA is larger, much larger actually, nearly $9,000. The earnings premia over AA completion is observed across most fields of study. If we consider, for example, this graph where it's reporting similar regression estimates as we reported in the previous slide, but now we're breaking them down by field and also reporting the results at different percentiles of the earning distribution. The red line corresponds to earnings at the 25th percentile, blue is median earnings, and gray corresponds to earnings at the 75th percentile. So if we focus on median earnings, again, the blue bars here, we see that CCB graduates experience higher earnings than those with associates in computer information technology, criminal justice, as well as nursing. Engineering technology is actually the only field where we estimate an earnings penalty, This is concentrated kind of among the lower earners in the sample. Now let's move on to estimating the earnings differences between completing a CCB degree versus a traditional BA from a four-year college. Similarly, here we're going to start by looking at those raw differences in median earnings, where we find that CCB graduates earn about $3,900 less than those with a traditional BA. As before, again, we want to be careful about the comparison group, and so we're adding progressively more control variables. And in our preferred specification is the one where we include field of study and state. So we are comparing individuals who graduate from the same state and the same field, both obtaining a BA. Some obtain the BA from a community college, others from a traditional four-year. When we make these more limited comparisons, we find an earnings penalty of approximately $2,800, which corresponds more or less to a 5.5% decrease in median earnings. Like we do in the previous results, we find meaningful variation in the earnings difference along the income distribution. Earnings penalties are slightly smaller among low earners at approximately $2,300. While interestingly, we do not find evidence of an earnings penalty for completing a CCB relative to a traditional BA among higher earners. For earnings at the 75th percentile, the difference is actually positive, although I will say it's not statistically significant. Okay, let me finish by looking at the differences in the earnings penalty associated with a CCB versus a traditional BA across the different fields that we considered already in the past. The largest negative difference is observed for graduates in computer and information technology, roughly $30,000 in median earnings, which again here is the blue bars. This is followed by graduates of programs in engineering technology, which also observe meaningful kind of earning penalties. Notice though that for the remaining fields, the earnings penalties are relatively smaller, and in some cases statistically insignificant. This is the case, for example, in education, where the penalties are much smaller, and in business, where we see smaller penalties, statistically insignificant, and actually a positive estimate among higher earners. Interestingly here, we actually find evidence of an earnings premium for those who graduate with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, and similarly for nursing. All right, so to summarize, this project leveraged PSEO data to conduct the first comprehensive analysis of the earnings associated with completing a CCB degree relative to other post-secondary credentials. In light of the growing prevalence of this degree, our paper offers initial insights into the returns to these degrees, filling a significant gap in the literature and also informing ongoing policy discussions. We find that CCBs offer a moderate earnings premium over associate's completion of about 14% of median earnings. And while it does typically result in earnings below that of graduates from traditional BA programs, these penalties are comparatively smaller than the premium at about 5.5% of median earnings. Overall, we see that CCB degrees offer an intermediate credential with potential for significant earnings gains across particular fields of study. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Camila. Super interesting. There's one question that Julia already answered in the chat, but I also want to raise up in case you want to say more about it. But someone asked if this study looks only at full-time earners.
It's a little bit hard for me to hear you. If Julia, if you can hear the question a little better and wanna.
Yeah. Yep. So I mentioned this in the chat, and you can read more about it online. I know Cody's here, so I'm sure he could say this more eloquently than me, but basically, yes, the PSEO data only include those folks who are, kind of the equivalent of working full time. I believe it's it's folks who earn the equivalent of full-time work at the federal minimum wage. And then the data also exclude folks who have 2 or more quarters of zero earnings.
Great, thank you. And there's another question in the chat that I'll raise up and see if Julia or Camila want to answer. For the comparisons with BA programs, were data from all colleges and universities in the same state included? I would imagine that variance in earnings would exist among BA graduates from different schools.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, Julia, but what I remember is that we did comparisons drawing on all kind of four-year colleges, and then we limited comparisons, including only four-year colleges that we consider to be more open access, so slightly more comparable to the community colleges, and results were pretty similar, regardless of kind of the set of four-year colleges that we included. But precisely because we also imagined there would be this large variance, like differences between, say, the large institutions and the smaller that are more open access, we did that. I don't remember if that was something that made it to the report, but I know that was something we did.
Yeah, I'm not sure that made it to the report, but that's right. And obviously we should also say that these are we're limited to institutions that have PSEO data. So not all institutions in a given state are going to be included there.
Right. Yeah, good point. Before we get to the next one, I also want to kind of go back and connect it to a question that was posed to Julia, you and CJ's first project that CJ presented on, which is thinking also of that, which I know isn't possible right now in the PSEO data, but also thinking about the cost of living aspect of it, which I imagine you might have considered, which is maybe folks who are getting a bachelor's at a community college are maybe place bound, or I don't know if they're more likely to be place bound or not, but then that might impact the cost of living and the expected earnings in a particular area, whether it be a very rural area or a very urban area or somewhere in between. But acknowledging that those data aren't available in PSEO, but just something that you all might have thought about as well. And then, Julia, I'm just going to ask, are you answering the follow-up question from Elizabeth in the chat? Okay.
I am, yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Can't be good. I actually have a question for, while Julia's doing that, for Camila, if you want to start with that. I'm just curious if you have any tips for folks who might be new to the PSEO data. Anything that was like a quirk when you all downloaded the data, or anything that you'd share as a tip?
I'll actually let Julia chime in on that. I personally was not very closely working with the data. But Julia, maybe there's something that you want to share there.
Sorry, I was deep in Elizabeth's question in the chat. Can you just repeat that one more time, Gina? Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. Absolutely. It's hard to multitask here. We're asking you to. Just curious if you have any tips for folks who are relatively new to the PSEO data, things that you encountered or quirks that you encountered that you thought, oh, if I would have known that from the beginning, I might have done things differently, or how you downloaded the data and things like that.
Yeah, I would say first and foremost that there's a ton of documentation online. I think our whole team was really impressed with just like the level of detail that has gone into the documentation. So I know it can be daunting, but I would really encourage folks to take a look at that. And then I think something that we encountered in both projects is, I mean, there are cell sample restrictions. So if an institution does not have kind of enough graduates, there are privacy protections, but you can kind of make changes to the level of aggregation that you're working with to get around some of those same things. So for example, there are a couple different levels of aggregation. You can aggregate at the institution by SIP level or just the institution level. And so by kind of moving up an aggregation level, in I think both of these projects, we were able to kind of get a fuller picture of some of the data that otherwise would have been privacy protected. So that's the one kind of thing that comes to mind off the top of my head, because it came up in both projects, but CJ might have other thoughts on that.
Yeah, if you don't mind me jumping in, Gina.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So I think I think the aggregation level, paying attention to the aggregation level and the differences in data availability by aggregation level is like an important thing. We were trying to do program level stuff, and it just turns out for, I think, like some mixture of privacy protection and coverage reasons, the like representativeness coverage reasons, the PSEO reports program level things only at the SIP2 level for the master's programs and the doctoral programs, but at the SIP4 level for the professional programs, which sort of ended up limiting our scope a little bit. And so just being aware of like little quirks like that, and some of that is like hard to it's so idiosyncratic and specific to a specific program that it's hard to say like, oh, that's general advice for any time you're using it. But if you want to do program level stuff, like paying attention, I think like there's like one specific thing that's like got the codes of the aggregation levels listed, like an Excel spreadsheet that I can see in my mind's eye that has like the list of all the aggregation codes. And that to me ended up being my Bible, because just figuring out the different aggregation levels is, as Julie was saying, like one of the most flexible things about the data is that there's just so many different aggregation levels. And I think at first blush, you might not be aware of how many aggregation levels there are. And it just allows for a lot of different kinds of analyses than you might, more than you might be expecting. And it's very cool that those like are pre-computed for you and pre-reported for you. So.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much. I want to highlight the fact that the theme of the day is folks are participating even if they're in an airport, because Lois is responding in the chat from an airport as well. So thank you so much. People are just committed to participating, and I love this. So I want to highlight folks to make sure, if you can, on whatever device you're using right now, to take a look at the chat as well. And I am now going to share my screen. I'm going to very briefly share some information from research that Ali Bell and I conducted. And this, I'm hoping, actually kind of brings it sort of back together for folks, to connecting the dashboard pieces, the downloading the data and using the entire data set or whatever portion of the data set you need piece, with using just the Explorer tool itself and what's possible there. So thumbs up from someone. Can you see my screen just to make sure that, okay, thank you, Chase. Awesome. So very quickly, I just want to share that Ali Bell and I conducted, actually, she authored 2 papers that are in our resource library. I co-authored the first one with her, and then she took the conversation a little further with her second paper. And these papers were written in a more conversational style, very intentionally, because we wanted to give an example of using the PSEO Explorer itself. So again, the Explorer is fantastic, and you can click around, and I'm going to talk a bit about that. The other methodology, obviously, for creating the dashboards that were demonstrated today, conducting the research that was shared today, is to download the data yourselves and do some of these analyses. But we wanted also to show, we also wanted to show what's possible if you just want to use the Explorer itself, and kind of how far you can go with that, so to speak, without maybe getting to the point where you think, oh, it's time for me to download the data and actually conduct an analysis a different way. So this is from the paper, as I said, that we co-authored. There's also another paper in a resource library by Ali that it's kind of part 2 of this paper. And the goals of our paper then was, again, to demonstrate use of the PSEO Explorer to examine research questions and to provide 2 different examples. So Ali and I both wanted to explore education fields, and for different reasons and in different ways. And so we write it, like I said, in a kind of a conversational style, where we both go through the connective data and dashboard strategy, which I'll show you in just a second, that helps you walk through using a complex dashboard like the PSEO Explorer as an example. So this is the connective data and dashboard strategy. So David Troutman and I came up with this last year, end of last year, or the beginning of last year, when we were creating a different paper thinking about PSEO data. And really, this is a way we think that helps folks kind of walk through something when you're using a dashboard. We were thinking specifically of the PSEO Explorer because that was something that we want more and more folks to use and be thinking about, but it's one way to kind of think about this process. And so really it starts over here with 1 and moves around, and obviously sort of, you'll see it's sort of never ending, but it's that way on purpose because we want to think about the fact that research is iterative, and especially research when you're looking at a dashboard is iterative, because you're thinking about, okay, I have a question I want to answer with this dashboard, and I want to see if it's possible to answer that, and that's the formulating the problem statement. Then you can dig in, click around, so to speak, in that dashboard and take a look at what are the data telling me, and look at it different ways. And to CJ and Julia's point, kind of learning what are some of those things, looking at when do I need to dig into the details of the PSEO data in this case a bit more. And then we have our third step, which is connecting the dots. And so that's when we think, okay, maybe I looked at these 3 different pieces within the Explorer. Now I want to connect those dots and think about what does that mean. Finally, generally speaking, although, and I'll explain a bit more about why Ali and I didn't necessarily get to the point of developing an action plan when I go through this very swiftly, but action plan then is thinking, if you're doing this for program evaluation, or you're doing this because you are thinking about at your institution adding a new program, and you want to look at information, related information about programs that you already have, or you're thinking of state policy questions that might be happening at your state agency or your system, that's where you would develop an action plan in this process to make use of these data actionable. For the purposes of this paper, we were exploring something as researchers and not as employees of an entity that would want to do something necessarily actionable with these data. So we didn't spend as much time on that piece, but I want to acknowledge it. And then what might happen is that you try something, and then you've got to have another problem statement, and you've got to interrogate the data again, perhaps a couple of years later, or perhaps in a different way to think about things and move forward. So I'm just really quickly going to go through the 3 major pieces of, again, there's 4 pieces, but the 3 major pieces of the strategy, the CDDS, and talk about kind of the different ways that Ali and I went about it. So you can see it's possible to use the Explorer to really answer some questions in different ways. So Ali is going to be in orange and I'm in blue, just to make it easier as you follow through this. So Ali was really interested, and she was pretty new to the PSEO data set at that point in time. And she was really interested in just learning more about it and seeing what's possible and, you know, so to speak, playing around in the PSEO Explorer. And so she was interested in graduates of education programs. And is there anything in there that can help us show the non-economic benefits, of pursuing major and career in education? So we know earnings are in the PSEO Explorer, but she was also interested in learning more about the flow data, the industry flow and the geographic flow. So that was her question. Her question was pretty broad. My question got more specific because I had recently read an article. I live in Colorado, and I had recently read an article that cited a report that conducted a study that said Colorado, especially border towns in Colorado, are losing their teachers to other states like Wyoming and New Mexico. And they were wondering why this is happening. And they were taking a look at earnings in particular, and also obviously geographic flow, because they're seeing where some of these teachers were going to rather than staying and teaching in Colorado. And so I was interested in looking at what can we tell about the combination of earnings and flow data when we look at these. And I wanted to specifically look at Colorado and nearby states. Again, as we've said repeatedly, not every state participates in PSEO, and not every institution in every state participates. But luckily for me, with my interest in Colorado, many of the states that border Colorado and are near Colorado do actually participate in PSEO. So I was able to dig into the data a bit. So we both did a deep dive into the data, and I'm, again, just going to say a couple things about this because I really would like to refer folks to this paper in the resource library, partly because it's more of a template or a guide than it is a paper. You can read and you can be interested in what Ali and I found, and it is, in my opinion, kind of interesting. We have some data tables and we have some ways that we looked at the data, but what we really tried to do in this paper was, and particularly Ali tried to do this with her broader question, is she'd pull some data or look at some data, and then she'd have some questions, and she'd say, I wonder why that is the case. And so she was, because she was new to the PSEO data set, provided sort of a running commentary, so to speak, of I found this and I wasn't sure why, and then I went back into the great, as has been referenced already, the great materials that Census provides to learn more about the data and why the data maybe are that way. So for instance, she started looking at some of the differences across states, and she was looking at, I'll point out specifically Michigan, and then looking at the data, you realize it's only the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor that is in the PSEO data set. So there's an example of something where you can't say, well, this is true in Michigan, because you're really only looking at one institution. Whereas when you're looking at the state of Texas, a really large portion of institutions in Texas are included in the data set. And so you are able to do some of that more extrapolation of this might be true in Texas, or here are kind of what we see in Texas, versus saying this is what we see in Michigan when you're really only talking about one institution. And so I just want to point out that with the deep dive into the data, that's what this paper was designed to do, is sort of pop up those questions that people might encounter and then have and point to kind of where you can find the answers to some of those things. I answered, as I said, a specific question, and I really was looking at what's possible to look at and to see if you're looking at one state and some of the states that are surrounding it. And you'll see my examples in there as well. This is the last thing I want to talk about really, is connecting the dots. Again, Allie had some generative ideas that she provided for, hey, if you're looking at these data to just explore the data, here are some things that you can learn. And then I really, kind of my aha moment, even though I've known these data for quite a while now, was to really see that overlapping benefit of exploring earnings and combining that with the flow data. Because what I was able to do is dig down eventually to each institution, each public institution in Colorado that has a bachelor's degree in education, and looking at where those folks move in and out of Colorado, their earnings, and also the flow of industry. We don't know exactly their job, but education is an interesting one in particular, because you can follow the vast majority of folks who get a bachelor's degree in the field of education do end up in the industry of education services. And so while we don't know if they're a teacher or a principal or working at a school in a different way, potentially, that they are probably at least in the field or the industry that they got their major in. And it was interesting to take a look at the different institutions and which ones we see the education field of study bachelor's degree recipients in staying in Colorado, and which have left Colorado within 1, 5, and 10 years. And we can kind of start to see that pattern. And maybe those are the places, of course, that are training the teachers that we're wanting to stay in Colorado from a state policy perspective. And then, as I mentioned before, I just put this briefly on there. Action plan, I want to call it out because it is an important aspect, that fourth aspect of the CDDS. But in our case, because we were doing this more theoretically and doing it as an example, we didn't necessarily spend a lot of time on the action plan. So I'm going to pop this up because we really want you to do this. We are researchers, after all, of course, and so I'm going to leave this up on the screen. We value data. That's why we're presenting to all of you on this data. But if you have a moment and can scan this and fill out, it's a very brief survey, but it'll just give us an idea, because we do want to continue to have these virtual showcases. We have some webinars that we held this summer, and we're going to plan to hold some webinars again next year. And I just want to thank you all for your interest in PSEO, in the PSEO Coalition. I want to thank all of our speakers and congratulate them once again, because this wasn't just featuring speakers. This was featuring speakers who participated in a competitive process, and they were awarded these research grants. And it's because of the strong proposals that they had, and because it's very exciting to then show that all of this came to fruition. We also, I don't have a date to announce yet, but since you registered for this, we have you on our email list now. And when we have our call for our next round of research grants, we will be sure and include all of you who registered for this event on our email when we do post that. We also are on LinkedIn as well under PSEO Coalition. So Thank you so much. And I want to do a shout out in the chat. They're all popping up in there, but I was going to shout them out anyways. First of all, Cody Orr and his colleague Andrew Foote and others, their other colleagues at US Census. We wouldn't have any of these data if it wasn't for them. And John and all of your colleagues at Strata Education Foundation for your generous support of this work. And thank you all for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And we'll see you all on LinkedIn and other places.